Hey, I got it. Well, good morning. Good morning. Make sure I turn my mic on here. All right, we're live. Good to see everybody. Whoa, wow. I didn't know I sounded like that. Uh, Good to see everybody this morning. I see some new faces. I see some people that I've never seen before. So if you are a guest with us, we're glad you're here. We are in part 3 of our series, Purpose, Why We're Here and What We Do. And the whole idea behind what we're doing here is trying to rediscover and reignite our purpose as Jesus followers, because we know that this is evidently true, that we find purpose, that literally we're unstoppable when we serve a cause greater than ourselves. And if we can find our purpose, man, the sky is the limit. The whole reason, again, and the problem that we've been dealing with in our series from day one really is this. It's that sometimes we forget why we're really here. Don't we? We forget why we walk in the doors. We forget why we have Christian fellowship. We forget why we read our Bibles and we pray, and some of us don't, and some of us do, and some of us struggle with the idea of what it means to be a Christian and why in the world would I want to be a part of the church. But let me tell you, there is some amazing things that happen with this church. There are some amazing things that happen with the church throughout the world. And the whole reason we're looking at this is because we're trying to rediscover and reignite. But I'll say it again, this too, that when we find purpose in serving a cause greater than ourselves, and when we look to that cause and we look at the reason why we're doing what we're doing and the reason for the existence of the church, it becomes very clear what our purpose is as Jesus followers. And again, I'm excited for this part because really we get to dive into some things that I think we don't often look at. But before we get to that, I really want us to dive back into this text we've been looking at for the past couple of weeks in Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45. But I want to focus in on a couple of things because there's a few things that Jesus says that I think are really, really important for us to pay attention to. We've been looking at different sections of this. The first week we kind of focused on this idea that focused on the idea of motive, right? What is behind why we do what we do? And then last week we focused on this idea of servant leadership. What kind of influence do we as Christians have, not in the circle of concern, but in the circle of influence? And then what was it that Jesus actually did with his life? He used his influence for good. He used his influence for people. And so this conversation that happens between Jesus and the disciples, they come to Jesus and they say, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you." And Jesus says, "Well, what do you want me to do for you?" Because Jesus isn't going to say no, right? This is, "What do you want me to do for you?" Could you imagine being Jesus sitting there? It's like, I know what they're going to ask. I know what they're going to say. I know what they're going to come across us. And he's premeditating his answer and saying, okay, well, And they ask him this question: when you're in your glory, can we sit at your right and your left? Right? Grant that we may sit on your right and on your left in your glory. Because the misconception of Jesus and the misconception of what he was actually doing there, even from his inner circle of people, was that he was going to be a great king and he was going to free the Jewish people and bring them back into military and economic power. And this idea that they had, we could be in positions of influence. And we really think we're the best men for the job. But Jesus turns around and he says, wait a minute. You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? They said to him, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you shall drink. He's referring to suffering. He's referring to his death. He's talking about what's going to come. And we have these suffering statements all over the Gospel of Mark. 8:31, 9:31, 10:30, 10:34. This is one of them. Or 10:31. Where he talks about what it is that he's going to do. He's going to go to the cross. He's going to suffer. He's going to die. And the disciples are just in disbelief. What do we do? We don't know what to do with this, Jesus. And she tells him, what's going to happen to me is going to happen to you. But he doesn't say it in those words, of course. He says, what's going to happen to me is going to happen to you. Do we think Do we think that what happened to Jesus could happen to us? Potentially. Potentially. We've lived in a very blessed culture where we've not been persecuted for Christianity. But it will come again. Persecution of the church will come, of all Christians, of anybody who preaches or proclaims the name of Jesus. And so when we look at this, what he's saying here, we have to understand something, that he's telling the disciples that, if you really want to be like me, you're going to be like me. You're going to follow me. You're going to spread my word. I'm going to pass the mantle to you so you can spread the gospel through the whole entire region. But guess what? You're going to suffer. Just like I suffer. You're going to drink the cup that I drink. And you're going to be baptized with the baptism with what I am, because we know that the parallel between the baptism of Jesus, where he received the Spirit, and the baptism of the disciples when they're sitting in the upper room, is similar. And then he goes on to say this. He says, but to sit on my right or my left is not mine to give, but it is for those whom it has been prepared. Hearing this, the 10 became indignant, right? With James and John. It means they were angry. Calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, you know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men, and exercise authority over them. So again, he's establishing this idea of leadership, right? I'm not going to be in a position where I force people to do things. People have to choose me. People have to choose me. But the Gentiles, whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. We've really been hitting this idea over and over and over and over again. So I have two observations that I want us to make this morning. One, people who choose to serve Jesus will suffer turmoil of some kind, whatever that is. We go through it. We have trials. We have tests. It's tests of character. It's tests of faith. It's tests of what are you going to do in this situation when it hits you in the nose? How are you going to respond? Are you going to respond like people in the world respond? Or are you going to respond like Jesus would respond? How are you going to respond to those things? You're going to suffer of some extent. And people who decided to follow Jesus knew that this was evident, and they knew that this was going to happen at some point. And the second thing, the second one is a question. Because I think it's a question we don't often ask. What does it look like to be last? I think about this a lot because when I look at Jesus, Jesus talks a lot about selflessness, right? He talks a lot about giving of yourself. And he talks a lot about trying to get the disciples to get their mind right, where, it's not about you. It's not about this kingdom. It's not about all this glorious thing that you think it's going to be. What it's really about is you serving other people for my cause, for a cause that's greater. But when we think of last, we always think of last place, right? You play a baseball game and you lose. Well, you're a loser. If you're last, you're a loser. We don't like that in our culture. We don't like loss. We like to win. We want to be the victors. And so to be last, well, if you're last, you're a loser. If you're last, that's wrong. It's not right. Well, how can you be both? Jesus tells us that if we want to be great, if we want to be first, we got to be last. We got to put ourselves last. That's what he's talking about. The idea that we have to understand here is that we live in a culture, in a society that promotes selfishness. And unintentionally, that selfishness creeps into the church. And it causes problems among people, right? Because your only thing, when you think about, disagreements or whatever that you've had in the past, right? Normally, when you have a disagreement, you're not thinking about, well, they should just agree with me, right? That's kind of how our political mindset is. That's kind of how our mindset is in the church sometimes. Well, they should just agree with me. And so there's this big ball of feud, clutter, and it never gets solved, and people just part ways and they go do their own thing because they can't get past their pride and their ego. And really, that's what's stopping us from being selfless. So what does it look like to be last? We've got 2 examples in the book of Philippians that show us what it looks like to be last. And I mean, I'm talking about people who understood the concept of if you want to be great, you have to be last. If you want to be great, you have to be a servant. You have to serve. That's what it costs. That's what it takes. And it's challenging because we don't want to sacrifice to be a servant. It's a challenge in our culture. Why should I don't like that. Why should I do that? I don't want to do that. Why would I want to do that? Oh, can you help me? Why? I don't want to. I don't want to be involved in that. That doesn't suit me. It's not my thing. And maybe that's legitimate at time points. But we're called to serve. Man, if it involves reaching those lost people, why are we hesitant? Why are we hesitant to serve in any capacity that allows us to preach the gospel to people, to put our pride and our ego aside and stand last? It's challenging. The problem, again, is sometimes our expectations exceed our reality, right? We look at life, or we look at a situation, or we look at a person, or we look at a leadership, and we have expectations, right? We have expectations of here's what we expect to happen. Here's what we expect from this thing. And then when it doesn't happen, our reality, our expectation is crushed, and we become discouraged, and we become disappointed with why it didn't happen. Well, expectation is a figment of the imagination. Is it not? We imagine in our minds what it should be like, but it almost never plays out that way. Our imagination, our expectation gets the best of us. We end up in a place where we're discouraged and disappointed. Think about the sports star. Anybody sports fans in here? Any kind of sport. It can be as low as soccer, or cricket, or I don't know what other sports there are. If you've ever watched sports, baseball, you're a baseball fan. You have guys that you really, especially as a young guy, I had guys that I looked up to that I was like, man, I want to be like that guy. Yeah, he's awesome. I want to be an athlete like that. I want to be recognized like that. I want to have his character and his conduct, and then that person, and your expectation is, man, they'll be a good person. They'll do the right things. They've got it together. I want to be like that because they've got it together. And then they fall. And you're like, what? Wait a minute. I thought in my mind that they were perfect. Maybe that's your experience in the church with how you grew up. Somebody you knew. Somebody you saw. Standing in the spotlight. Big figure. Great example. Ultimately, only to come to their fall. And to walk away from Jesus. And then what does that do to your faith? Part of the problem is when those kinds of things happen, and we walk away because someone else falls away, it's because we've tethered our faith in the wrong place. Again, it's an expectation that exceeds reality. Reality is what could really happen. Expectation is maybe what should happen or could happen. What really happens and what could happen are 2 different things. And so in our minds, we have to understand that when it comes to serving Jesus and trying to put ourselves out, we have to really try. It doesn't just happen. Some people are just naturally gifted. They put other people first, other people's interests first. But a lot of us have to work at it. A lot of us have that challenge of what does it look like? What do I do? And do my expectations of this thing exceed what's actually real? And that's why bottom line is so important. This is the one thing that you need to know. If you've tuned out, if you're tuned out this morning, or you haven't caught on to what we're kind of doing here, this is the only thing you need to know for the rest of the week to understand what we're going to talk about in this lesson. And that is Model the behavior of people who model Christ. So who are those people? Who are those people who we should look after, who model? Because sometimes it's hard to spot. We see a big guy in a spotlight and he's doing a lot of good things and doing a lot of showing. You look at him and you're like, man, I want to be like that guy. And then he falls. And then so what do we do? How do we find it? Well, in the book of Philippians, we've been talking about a couple of different things. We've been talking about this verse in chapter 2 in verses 34 and 35. We've been bringing it back up because it's the key verse of the entire book. If you want to know what the book of Philippians is about, you go to this verse right here and you look at it. The whole entire summation of the book is right here. Paul puts it in. He says, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. In other words, don't just look inwardly, look outwardly. Because there was a disruption and a problem taking place in Philippi. There's a disagreement or some division happening. And the problem was that they were only looking out for their own personal interests, or there was a group of people who were only looking out for their own personal interests, and they were causing disruptions. And Paul is trying to sway their mind because Paul has a close relationship with this church. In fact, he was the one that started this congregation in Philippi in Acts chapter 16 when he met Lydia by the river. And he started this congregation, and he knows these people, and he's familiar with their life, and he understands what they're going through, and he understands the culture, and he understands the expectations. And so Paul says, look, you've got to be different. You don't know what I mean? Look at Jesus. The text we looked at last week. You want to know what it looks like to be humble, to be selfless, to be kind, to be loving? Look at Jesus, because that's where he goes right after this. He says, do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. And that's not always likes and dislikes. That's looking out for, you know what, maybe they have a problem or an issue or a challenge with this particular thing, and I need to, maybe I have a difference of opinion or difference of view, and I just need to lay down for a minute and just stay low and look out for the interests of other people, because that's what Jesus did. And we talk about, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? It's a cliche, but it works. And Jesus did things that I never did. I'll never do things the same way that Jesus did. I can try, and I can try, and you can try, and you can try, but it will never, ever happen. All we can model and all we can hope for is that we have enough examples in our life of people who understand the character and live him out and try to model that, to model the behavior of people who model Christ. And so Paul, as he proceeds through this letter, he starts to give examples of different characters, especially in the book in chapter 2. He gives a lot of character references. He starts with Jesus, then he goes to himself, and then he goes to Timothy, and then he goes to this guy named Epaphroditus. And he talks about these guys as if they have perfected, as if they have modeled what it looks like to be like Jesus. First, he mentions Timothy. Now Timothy, again, was traveling with Paul when he set up this church. He says, I hope to send Timothy to you shortly so that I also may be encouraged. Now, we learned a couple of weeks ago that Paul's in a difficult circumstance. Paul's in a challenging place. He's in a prison. He's not in a 3 meals a day prison, have a shower prison, your own cell, your own bed, cleanly prison. He is in a horrible, horrible, horrible place, awaiting a sentence. He got sent to jail, and he's awaiting a sentence to whether or not he's going to live or he's going to die. And so there's this man, Timothy, that's with him, this guy, very close friends, Timothy, Epaphroditus. He's like, I want to send Timothy to you, so I can learn of your condition, so I can be encouraged in my circumstances. He says, for I have no one else of kindred spirit who would genuinely be concerned for your welfare. Now pay attention to what he's saying here, because he's telling us what it looks like to model the attributes and model the characteristics of selflessness, ultimately of Jesus. Ultimately, if we're going to start with Jesus, and we're going to look realistically at what he did, we know we're never going to reach that point. But there's human people who live those things. There's human people who have strived their entire life to live like Jesus, and they're trying, and they're messing up, but they're trying, and they're continuing to live. And he says, this man is just like that. He's like, I have no one else who'll be concerned for your welfare like Timothy. For they all seek after their own interests and not those of Christ Jesus. Their mindset's different. Their ideas are different. Their thought process is different. He may be mentioning the group that's causing disruption or division within this particular church. You go back to chapter 1, verses 12 through 20, and he talks about these different groups that are causing problems or challenges for Paul himself. And then you go to chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, and we read of the challenges that are happening between the two women in this congregation. He says, you're seeking after your own interest. You're not seeking after the interest of Jesus. But you know of his proven worth, that he served with me in the furtherance of the gospel, like a child serving his father. In other words, we read 2 personal letters just to Timothy, just to his ministry in Ephesus. Just to the challenges that Timothy is facing. Paul is extremely close with this individual. He has much confidence in the character and the work of Timothy. And if you're in a distressed church and someone who knows you, or someone who's been there, someone who started it, someone who's a founding member or very influential over the church says, hey, I'm going to send this guy to you, and let me tell you about him. He's a spitting image. He's a selfless character. He's not coming in there to make it what he wants it. He's coming in there to look after your interest and the interest of Jesus. And you need to trust me when I say it. He's my closest companion. He's with me right now while I'm in prison, while I'm writing this letter, while I'm sending it to you to encourage you and to thank you for your gift in my circumstances. I'm sending Timothy to you. And so there's likely this back and forth. Timothy and Epaphroditus, one going with Paul, one going with these different churches, one going with Paul, one going with these different churches. And he says, he served me like a child served his father when I was preaching the gospel. Therefore, I hope to send him immediately as soon as I see how things go with me. And I trust in the Lord that I myself will also be coming shortly. In other words, he thinks his sentence is coming soon, so he's going to send. So as soon as he figures out what's going on, he's going to send Timothy. Again, this is the personal part of the book of Philippians where he's talking about these characters, trying to help us understand their characteristics, their values, their selflessness. But I thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, who is your messenger and minister to my need. So he mentions this other character, Epaphroditus. And he says, I thought it necessary to send this one individual. Is that I had Paul and I had Timothy and I had Epaphroditus with me, and I said, you know what, I thought it was necessary that I send Epaphroditus to you, my brother and my fellow worker. He's giving this man credibility. Not only is he giving him credibility, but there's evidence from chapter 4, verse 18, that they know Epaphroditus already. That he was a minister at that congregation, that he was working with that church. And so he sends Epaphroditus back with this credibility. My fellow worker, my fellow soldier, who is also your messenger and minister to my need. He was with me. Because he was longing for you all and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. For indeed he was sick to the point of death. But God had mercy on him, and not only him, but also on me, so that I would not have sorrow upon sorrow. Now, I want you to look at this last phrase here. We know that Epaphroditus at some point was sick, almost to the point of death. Now, put this in your mind for a minute. Christianity is under some heavy persecution. Not full heavy persecution, but they're under some persecution here. And they're dealing with, could you imagine just if people started, people were out preaching the gospel and working with people, and all of a sudden they were getting sentenced and they were dying. They were just capping us off one by one by one by one by one. And they were taking people you loved, and they were taking people who were talented and skilled and people who were doing the work. And one by one by one. And you know what? You have to continue to do, because eventually what they were hoping to do was to wipe out Christianity, but they couldn't do it. They still can't do it. They tried to wipe us all out right now. They still couldn't do it, because people would still follow Jesus. People would still preach Jesus, and probably more intensely than we preach him right now. You ever think about that? You ever think about how much more intense Christianity would be if it was going to cost us our life to preach the gospel? I'm not talking about sickness. I'm talking about persecution. Epaphroditus was sick. He wasn't persecuted. But Paul was losing friends. He said, God had mercy on him, and he also had mercy on me, so that I would not suffer sorrow upon sorrow. When you're alone in prison, and the only friend you have is about to die, but he's there. He's not thinking about himself. He's thinking about you, and you're thinking about him, and there's this mutual relationship. And he says, he wants to get back to this church with these Philippians to help them work out whatever problem or difficulty they're having, but he's sick and he can't move. And he says, look, he says this in the next verse. Look at this. Therefore, I have sent him all the more eagerly, so that when you see him again, you may rejoice, and I may be less concerned about you. Receive him in the Lord with all joy, and hold men like him in high regard. Why? Look at the next verse. Because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was deficient in your service to me. Now, he's specifically talking about a gift that the Philippian church was sending. He was there to encourage them. He was there to gather it. He was there to bring it to Paul in whatever way. And we're talking about, ship rides, and we're talking about long treks of travel. We're not talking about getting in a Jeep and going four-wheeling, or we're not talking about getting on the highway and going to Ephesus from Jerusalem. We're not talking about a 30-minute to an hour-long drive. We're talking about months and months and months and months. Our time travel, we could get to the Oregon border in 8 hours from here, easily. We could be in Mexico in 6 hours. We could be across the border in Nevada in 2 hours. We could be all the way across the United States in a day if we drove straight, maybe a day and a half. So our time travel is not in the same length. They didn't have that type of transportation. So we're talking about months and months and months. If Epaphroditus left, he's gone for months because he's traveling to go get this gift from Philippi, and he's coming back. And Timothy is gone for months and months and months. So Paul is alone. And if he loses one of these guys, he's alone. But he wants the church in Philippi to recognize the character of this guy. Hold him in high regard. The Apostle Paul told the church in Philippi to hold Epaphroditus in high regard. Could you think about that for a minute? Would the Apostle Paul say the same about you? Why? Why would he say that about Epaphroditus? Well, he values him. He values his character, his service. And so he wants the people in Philippi. I mean, again, we look at this verse, and we have to understand that the individuals are dealing with a internal congregational problem. And Paul says, look, this is how you fix it. You follow Jesus. You put your pride aside, and you let the people, and you let other people, if you can't put your ego and pride aside, you let other people do that. You let other people lead. Some people won't. So this is the important thing that we have to remember about this. That unity problems are solved with selfless people. Not with egotistical people, prideful people, selfish people. It's not solved like that. And this all comes back to when we're serving a cause greater than ourselves, selflessness has to come to the forefront, especially for Jesus followers. We don't solve issues and problems and difficulties and all these things that we face in regular life, whether it's in the church or out of the church, by being selfish. We solve it by being selfless. And I'm not talking, when I say selfless, I'm not talking about being passive. And I'm not talking about not sticking up for yourself. And I'm not talking about not saying anything. What I'm talking about is not looking out for your own personal gain, your own personal interest, but looking out for the interests of other people. Whether it's a moral obligation or a moral problem that we're dealing with, we have to understand that selflessness plays into every fiber of life in the church. That's why it's so important to learn how to be selfless. You can't be a servant if you're not selfless, can you? I mean, I guess you could. You could do whatever somebody tells you to do and only be doing it for recognition, I guess. But is that what we're supposed to be doing it for? Is that why we're supposed to come here? No, we come here to be encouraged. Every Sunday I pull up here, I'm encouraged by somebody. Doesn't matter who it is. Doesn't matter if I spend an hour and a half up in that booth. As soon as I come down, I'm encouraged by somebody. That's what we're here for. You should be encouraged. You should encourage somebody else. But there's questions we need to ask. I mean, sometimes sacrifice is necessary for furtherance of the gospel, right? What are you willing to do to reach the lost? What are you willing to do? I mean, when you really think about selflessness and play with how are we reaching people? Are people coming to look, coming to see? What are we willing to do to reach the lost? Do you ever think about that? I think about this all the time. What am I willing to do? And the answer is always, well, not very much. I should be willing to do more. So I try to push myself. You know, I ask myself this question too, and this is a question that's going to challenge you. This is the question that's going to set the tone for your week, because I want you to remember this, and I want you to be aware of this idea as we play into the series, because it's important. Are you all in? Are you all in like Timothy, like Epaphroditus? Man, exceptional people. But if they can do it, so can we. So can we. Maybe it's in a different capacity. Maybe it's in a different form. Maybe it's not, we're serving somebody in prison, because it doesn't work like that these days. But are we all in like those guys? That's where I want to be. And I struggle with it. And I know other people struggle with it. Am I all in? I ask myself, am I all in? Am I in this? Is this for me? Why? If I'm not, why not? You ever think about that? If not, why not? And then is it fear? Is it uncomfort? What is it that's causing me not? Why? And how do I overcome that challenge? How do I overcome that difficulty? I mean, everybody faces a different challenge. Everybody faces different things. Everybody has different fears. But my fears are different than everybody's fears in this room. We might have some similarities. We might cross paths at some point, but my fears are different. Your fears are different. And so your question, am I all in, is based on what your fear is and what your discomfort is. And then you got to ask yourself, why? Why am I uncomfortable? If I'm all in, what am I really willing to do to reach the lost? What am I really willing to do? Because those are the questions we have to ask. I was sitting on this passage all week, and I'm thinking to myself, I love my job, and I love what I do, and I love that I get to teach, and I love that I get to preach. And I think, is that all it boils down to? Is just what I'm willing to do? Or do I have to do some things that are uncomfortable sometimes? Some things that are going to challenge me? Because to be honest, I'm not really nervous getting up here, as you can tell. I used to be. When I was a very new Christian, there was a guy that asked me about 24 hours after I got out of the water if I wanted to preach. And I hesitantly said yes. And we were at a funeral a couple years ago, and my dad, and I had already been preaching for a while and working on my craft and developing. My dad gets up and he stands up there, and I hear him, and he's talking real fast, and he's, you can tell he's kind of nervous. And all I saw was me when I first started preaching. It was that nervousness. If you don't do it a lot, it's going to be uncomfortable, right? If you're not familiar with it, or you think there's a fear of it. I remember being in high school and being in Spanish class, and the Spanish teacher asking me to come up and say one paragraph in Spanish, and I was like, no. I did it. I didn't like it. I didn't continue to give one paragraph speeches in Spanish, as you can tell. It wasn't comfortable for me. But if it was something that was going to benefit somebody else, maybe I could try it. It'd be really uncomfortable. It'd be really challenging. We think about those things in our life, those experiences that we've had, the things that make us uncomfortable are the things we need to work on. They're weaknesses, they're challenges. So we ask this question, am I all in? And what am I willing to do to reach the lost? Next week, when we come back, we're going to talk about contentment. We're going to talk about the idea of how that plays into this Christian conduct and character and influence and service and purpose and understanding why we're here and what we're doing. So, if you are a guest with us here today, we're glad you're here. And we hope that next week you'll join us for our final installment of this series, Purpose, why we're here and what we do. If you have a need of any kind, if you're maybe struggling with some type of sin, or you're struggling with whatever it is in your life, maybe you're not comfortable coming up and sitting on the front pew, and that's okay. That's okay. You don't have to do it. It's not a challenge of, I'm doing something in the service. Tell somebody. That's all I want you to do. Just tell somebody. Doesn't have to be me, doesn't have to be one of the elders. You can tell an elder. They'll probably have something helpful to say to you, and something helpful, some direction to guide you, whatever it is you're struggling with, whatever sin you're dealing with. If it's a sin, maybe it's a relational problem or a work problem or something of that nature. If it is, you can talk to somebody. You can tell somebody. If you feel the need to come forward, you can do so as we stand and sing.